Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to call this meeting California Racial and Identity Profiling Act Accountability and Complaint Committee to order. Thank you all for being here and for your ongoing commitment to this important work. We have a full agenda ahead of us. Let's begin by confirming again the quorum and then moving right into roll call and approving of the agenda. I'd like to
I'd
know if
like to know if
Apple.
Apple.
I'm sorry, Co-Chair
I'm
Hawkins,
sorry,
I'm
Co-Chair
having a
Hawkins,
little
I'm
bit of
having a little
trouble
bit of
hearing you,
trouble hearing.
and I'm getting some feedback.
Can you hear me now? And is there still feedback?
Sounds good to me.
Okay.
I wasn't able to hear, I'm not sure if other board members could hear, but I was not able to hear the last thing you had said.
Okay, I said we have a full agenda ahead of us, so let's begin by confirming again the quorum and then moving right into the roll call and approval of last month's agenda.
Excellent.
Hello?
We do have quorum, so please feel free to begin introductions.
Okie dokie. Who would like to start?
I'll jump in. This is Angela Sierra. Good afternoon, everybody. I am an attorney with the California Department of Justice, and I'm the Attorney General Rob Bonta's designee on this board. Let's see, I will turn it over to Chauncey Smith.
Good afternoon, Chauncey Smith, Catalyst, California, appointee of Attorney General Bonta. I will pass it to board member Chavez.
Good afternoon, everyone. Chavez, she, her, board member appointee by Viserys, former Attorney General. I'll pass it over to Bill.
Hey, I'm Bill Armeline. I'm a professor at San Jose State University, and I'm executive board NAACP of San Jose and Silicon Valley. I will pass it over to DJ Kreiner.
Thanks, brother. DJ Kreiner, pastor of St. Louis Baptist Church, planning commissioner of the city of Fresno, appointed by attorney Rob Bonta. I will pass it back to, who's next? Is there anyone else? Anna? Well, Sister Chair, I'll turn it back into your hands.
Thank you, co-chair. Hi, my name is LaWanda Hawkins. I'm in Southern California. I'm with an organization called Justice for Murdered Children. And I was appointed, this is my second term, and I was appointed by Governor Newsom. And is there any other board members that didn't get a chance to introduce themselves? Please come aboard. If not, let's continue with the agenda. Let's go to the approval of February the 12th, 25 minutes.
Are you calling for a motion, Sister Chair?
I'm calling for us to review the minutes and then a motion.
All right, so moved.
I will second.
I'd like to say thank you. DOJ, do we need to have a vote?
We do. So just to confirm, the motion that's on the table is to approve the February 12th, 2025 subcommittee meeting minutes as written. And I'll go ahead and take a roll call vote. Member Armeline. Member Armeline votes aye. Member Kreiner.
Yes.
Member Kreiner votes aye. Member Hawkins.
Aye.
Member Hawkins votes aye. Member Sierra.
Aye.
Member Sierra votes aye. Member Smith.
Aye.
Member Smith votes aye. And Member Vang.
Aye.
Member Vang votes aye, and the motion passes unanimously.
Okay, thank you. Now, the next thing on the agenda is the update from the Department of Justice. Hello?
Good afternoon. My name is Rebecca Fretz. I'm with the California Department of Justice. I'm a Deputy Attorney General, and myself and Martha Gomez, who's also a Deputy Attorney General, will be presenting an overview of the draft accountability and civilian complaints sections, the proposed outlines for those sections. And I believe Martha is going to start this presentation, and then I will complete it. So I'm going to turn it over to Martha.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Rebecca, for that introduction. So as you can see here, we're going to be going through accountability and complaint. I will do the accountability. Rebecca will handle the complaint section. If we can go to the next slide. So this is going to be a global roadmap of the anticipated draft that we will be putting together for the subcommittee. And one of the things we want to begin with is a little bit of background on the emergence of the civilian oversight agencies and what was kind of their intended purpose and what was the community impetus, and including the objectives that the reasons that are articulated by the civilian oversight entities as to why they're created and what they intend to achieve, the practices that have been agreed to as effective through the literature, and also the impacts that each type of civilian oversight model has on racial and identity profiling and public safety. And closing with a little bit of the overview of the types of civilian oversight models that we have in California, and how they overlap with the models that are being identified as effective or not effective. And then from there, we would want to, update the certification data and go a little bit more into the complaint section pending, the updates that are coming. Slide. And so we're not going to go very deep because I know that this is a lot of information, but there is a general progression that indicates that race issues in America have influenced the basis for the creation of civilian oversight. Originally in the progressive era, which is late 1800s to early up to the 1920s, we saw the first form of a civilian oversight body. It was concerned with addressing police corruption generally. That was not very successful. It was too it itself had no resources, and it was also seen as a corrupt entity, and it didn't really lead anywhere. We began to see more formalized civilian oversight emerge in the 1920s as police tensions were increasing with community generally. And those initial 1920s and organizations were not well resourced, didn't have a lot of authority and jurisdiction. And so that led to followed by the 1930s to the 1950s, which saw more riots and uprisings over race relations with police, including regarding racial communities, racial tensions between police and communities. And in 1948, we saw the rise of the first civilian review board established in Washington, D.C. in America. And that was in response to the police using excessive force against the African-American community. That continued to escalate in the 1990s when there were significant changes to policing, reform efforts, and civilian oversight in response to racial disparities in enforcement and media coverage of police misconduct and corruption. That caused more civilian oversight bodies to be to develop throughout the United States and even further in the 2020s with the George Floyd protests and the subsequent public outcry over police misconduct. And since then, there's been many more that have hundreds that are scattered throughout the United States of America. So what is slide? What is the purpose or goal or objective of these civilian oversight bodies? So generally, 93% would agree that it's to restore public trust. And so there's 98% agree that it's restoring public trust. The high percentages agree that it's ensuring accessible complaint process, promoting thorough, fair investigations, holding law enforcement agencies accountable for law officers' behavior, promoting change in law enforcement, improving community law enforcement relations, public trust in the complaint process. So what's interesting about all of these agreed to objectives is that they don't expressly state that they intend to reduce racial disparities. It's kind of implied there, but it's not stated. And so it's not a metric. It hasn't been a metric that has been looked at. And so there is a way in which the community has assumed that the creation of a civilian oversight body will result not only in increased public trust and safety and all these other things, but also in the reduction of the disparity. And that'll become relevant later. Slide. The metrics of what is effectiveness, and mind you, the effectiveness is in relation to the objectives. And this is actually was previously discussed in the 2023 RIPA report. So this is not new information about what constitutes the factors that lead to an effective civilian oversight. But they include, having the independence to run your entity. Having a clear jurisdiction and authority over what complaints you can handle and what you can do without there being a disruptive force or ambiguity. Having access to records and facilities. Having access to executives, internal affairs staff, officers, department staff. Having stakeholder support. I mean, this is an example where, leaving positions vacant or not funding positions is a silent way of amputating the capacity of the civilian oversight body to do its role because it's not doesn't have the resources or adequate funding and operation resources, public reporting and transparency, right? Not having another secret society, analysis of policies and patterns that are based on statistical data, outreach, involvement, and stakeholder support. Constantly getting the community to be engaged and to participate and have this, not just in the case of an emergency or a situation, but ongoing support. And then the confidentiality, so that people can bring complaints forward without, or participate in the process as a witness without fear of retaliation. Slide. So we want to talk about the impacts that these civilian oversight entities have. There is the more recent literature showing that there is a relationship or overlap between what constitutes an effective practice and a decrease in racial profiling. All forms of civilian oversight entities, and we'll talk about them, the models in the next slide, but all models have a tendency to reduce racial disparities and disorderly conduct arrest. And these are the type of situations or encounters that are considered high discretionary situations. And all civilian oversight entities, regardless of their model or their type, also decrease racial disparities by 6% each subsequent year that they continue to exist over time. However, for more police encounters that have less discretion, like when you will use deadly force, that's a low discretionary situation. In order to see a decrease in racial disparities there, you need a more aggressive civilian oversight body, a more robust, more well-resourced, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Notably, the more aggressive civilian oversight bodies also reduce homicides in police officers. So the improved safety is as to everybody, goes both ways. Slide. So there's typically three, and so the literature oscillates between how you label them, and they're not static. So there can be overlap, and so the first type is called the review model. Then we have the investigative model and the monitoring auditing model. The hybrid is not its own model. It's just sometimes you can have an entity that kind of morphs a little bit, takes a little bit of a couple of the above, or and makes its own hybrid. And so that's what we're referring to. But you can still look at its features that are deemed successful to see like what's working for that community. So let's look here. So the review model is this model provides community members outside or unaffiliated with law enforcement with an opportunity to review the quality of misconduct investigations performed by the agency. So you kind of get to see what is internal affairs doing. Let's look at this investigations. Let's look at the data that was collected, who was interviewed, what was looked at. And it gets to focus on the quality of completed internal affairs investigations. It makes recommendations to police executives regarding findings or requests that further investigation be concluded. It's commonly headed by a review board composed of citizen volunteers, and they often hold public meetings to collect community input and facilitate police community communications. So one of the key strengths here that we see is that a core desire or objective is to increase community relations and trust. And so the review model has a tendency to do exactly that because it has a civilian review board and it has community meetings. So there's a lot of buy-in from the community. I guess, I don't know if you see this as a plus, but it is considered one of the least expensive because the board are typically volunteers. But there's some limitations in that it doesn't have the ability to conduct its own investigations and have like its own subpoena power, and it doesn't have like trained investigators are fully on staff. So it's a pro con in this one. As to the review model's ability to decrease racial disparities, we know that every single model reduces racial disparities in high discretionary situations. But for purposes of low discretionary situations like homicide, it does not decrease the racial disparity. So although this sort of civilians body is effective at achieving some of the stated goals and including some racial disparities, it's not necessarily the most effective in comparison to other models. Doesn't mean it has to be everyone has to have the same model. Every jurisdiction is different, has different sizes, different budgets, different, and so that's something that has to be kept in mind as well. So the investigative model, this one is has authority to classify citizen complaints. It has the authority to conduct the investigation into the alleged police misconduct independently of the internal affairs unit. It employs professionally trained investigative staff to conduct investigations and other full-time staff. It has authority to issue findings to the police, authority to recommend or impose discipline, and a substantial budget. It's probably one of the most expensive because it's organizationally complex, and you need people with expertise. And generally, they have greater access to law enforcement records and databases, more likely to have the ability to subpoena documents and witnesses. So with this model, some of the strengths that we see in terms of our objectives is that it may decrease bias in investigations into citizen complaints. You have highly specialized individuals who know how to conduct investigations. And so this may lead to an increase in trust by the community. Some of the issues with it is that it's very expensive, complex, and there may be resistance from law enforcement. In terms of this investigative model's capacity to impact racial disparities, this model is the model that has both a decrease in, of course, disorderly conducts, but also in homicide of citizens. So there's a statistically significant decrease in jurisdictions with regard to homicides and disorderly conduct. And the other interesting thing about this more robust investigative model is that we also see decreased homicides of police officers. And they're associated with the reduction in the violent crime rate and line of duty homicides of police officers. And so it's not, and so basically that's an important point, because I think sometimes we think of public safety as like, whose public safety are we defining? In this model, the public safety extends beyond the citizens, and also it increases the safety of the peace officer. And so the third model, which is actually the last, is the monitoring or auditing model. That one is they're authorized to audit, monitor, investigate, and review a wider range of law enforcement policies, practices, and procedures. This is intended to conduct systemic reviews of police practices and to examine patterns in complaint investigations, including patterns in the quality of the investigation, findings, and discipline, sometimes referred to as Inspector General or police monitors. Some auditors or monitors may actively participate in open or internal investigations. So one of the potential strengths of this model is that you can have more robust public reporting practices than other types of oversight entities. It's often less expensive than a full investigative agency, and it can be more effective at promoting long-term systemic change in police departments. One of the weaknesses, though, is it's like, you have to balance these against each other, is that there may be some community skepticism, because the objective of the civilian oversight body is not to go to individual misconduct, and it's not intended to discipline officers at the individual level. It's the overall practices and the overall policies. So it's effectuating change through the top rather through the bottom up. And so in that instance, some community members may not see it as fully redressing the misconduct that they see at the community level, even though it may actually have the capacity to do so. The monitoring and auditing model is more like the review model. It does have the reduction in high discretionary encounters of disorderly conduct, but no reduction in racial disparities with regard to homicide of citizens. And so what we wanted to do with this information is look at the major law enforcement agencies in the state of California, wave 1 and 2, and see like what are the sorts of civilian oversight bodies that exist, and how do they, what features do they have based on these above models, so we can kind of see like what is the status of our civilian oversight bodies in major institutions in California. And slide. Okay, so I'm going to hand this over to Rebecca, and I will remain here for later if there are questions.
Thank you, Martha. I'm just going to complete the overview of the accountability section for the 2026 RIPA report, and then I'll provide a brief overview of the civilian complaints section. So as discussed during the last subcommittee meeting, The report will include an update of the categories of SB2 data that were included in the 2025 RIPA report. We'll pull these numbers closer to the end of the year so that we have a full year's data set. But last year we included several different categories of SB2 data, including the number of misconduct reports from law enforcement agencies and complaints from the public that are received by post, including complaints that involve demonstrating bias, common grounds for certification actions initiated by post, and law enforcement agencies with 9 or more decertification actions. SB2, as the subcommittee also discussed during the last meeting, the SB2 section will also include a geographic analysis of SB2 data and outcomes. This will include analysis of regional differences in SB2 data in California. We're currently working on a model of how this will look like, and we should be able to provide more information for the board's consideration at the next subcommittee meeting. Next slide, please. So now I'll provide a brief overview of the civilian complaints section of the 2026 report. There'll be 4 possible main areas currently that we're working on. First, a data analysis of 2024 civilian complaint data, updates of prior board recommendations, 2026 board recommendations, and if the board would like to include it, we can include a possible vision for future reports, which could look at any topics that the board would like to preview for the next year's report, for the 2027 report. Next slide, please. So first, in the data analysis of the 2024 civilian complaints section, this will be very similar to last year's report in the complaints section. It will include highlight data and trends related to citizen complaints about law enforcement. As with the 2025 report, this data analysis will include an overview of civilian complaint data for RIPA agencies, including the number of civilian complaints alleging racial or identity profiling, and they'll be broken down into the 9 required categories of profiling categories, including age, physical disability, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, mental disability, gender, religion, gender identity expression, and nationality. The data analysis section will also include an update on the dispositions of civilian complaints reported by RIPA agencies over the past year. In addition to the number of complaints received, RIPA agencies are required to report the disposition or outcomes of those complaints to the Cal DOJ. And as with last year's report, this section can include the number of complaints that were sustained, exonerated, not sustained, or unfounded. And finally, this data analysis section can include, as it did last year, a cross-year comparison. As stated in last year's report, this comparison is to aid in monitoring individual agencies from year to year and any policy changes in complaint procedures that may correlate with the changes in complaint data. In the 2025 report, the board reported the RIPA complaint data using wave designations such as wave 1 and wave 2 agencies, etc. The 2026 report can include a similar grouping by wave designations to allow for that same cross-year comparisons by agency size and give an opportunity to observe differences in policies and procedures that may have changed over time. Comparing by waves also provides an opportunity to compare the complaint data with agencies of similar sizes. Next slide, please. Second, the complaints section can also include an update on prior board recommendations. The subcommittee discussed during the last meeting about the previous recommendation to remove deterrent language in complaint forms. The subcommittee asked to include an update on the California Supreme Court case, LA Police Protective Leave versus City of LA, which is analyzing whether the constitutionality of Penal Code Section 148.6. The recent update we have on this case is that oral arguments were heard last week, and while there hasn't been a decision, hasn't been issued yet, we do expect that to be issued shortly. So we can include that update, any updates on that case in the 2026 report. Also, a topic that the board could discuss today is whether the board would like to monitor any other past recommendations made in previous reports and include any other topic areas, updates on any other previous recommendations in this year's report as well, such as just an example given here on the slide is such as the need to adopt a uniform definition for civilian complaints or any other past recommendations if the board would like to also provide updates on any recommendations that you've given in the past that you think are particularly important to highlight in this year's report. Next slide, please. And finally, there can be a section in this year's report, as previous reports, on any recommendations the board has regarding civilian complaints. This is also a topic that the subcommittee may want to discuss more today. If there's any recommendations that you'd like to discuss and include in this year's report, also the Cal DOJ is, happy to also work up some recommendations and present them, at future subcommittee meetings. And I think that concludes our presentation on the accountability and complaints, our overview of those draft sections of the report. And we're happy to either answer any questions now you may have on these outlines for the report, or we're also happy to answer questions later in the meeting during the board's discussion of the 2026 report.
Any questions? Fellow committee members? Angela?
Thank you. So Martha and Rebecca, thank you. That was those really great presentations. And I think this is going to make for a really strong section of our report. A couple of items I just wanted to kind of highlight, at least for me, as I'm thinking through this. In looking at, I thought the point that was made about why reducing racial disparities has not been so much of a metric in the past and has been kind of implied throughout. I think that's a really important point, and I think that should be definitely included in this section. And I'm on that point, on that we are starting to see some research and metrics on that. One question I had, and maybe for additional research or discussion, is with respect to what those more recent researchers are finding on what reduces racial profiling or racial disparities, excuse me. Is there much discussion as to what they believe is the causal link between like the different types of oversight agencies and then the reductions they're seeing? I think that could be really important to think about as we're thinking of potential recommendations. And then the other kind of question I have is whether, with respect to the monitoring and auditing model that you discussed, was there any, have you seen anything yet in those models or examples of those models where, instead of only looking at maybe systemic issues with respect to complaints or investigations, could that type of model have a role in looking at, their own LEA's stop results and trying to kind of examine stop data and the disparities they're seeing and trying to figure out like what systemic issues may be contributing to the statistics that they're seeing? So that was just, one thing I was thinking, maybe that could be a role, potential role of a monitoring agency or entity with respect to our stop data. And I think that is kind of the key points I just wanted to raise. I just really think this is a great building off of our earlier reports and taking a deeper dive in these issues. So thank you so much for doing this work for us and helping us on this.
Awesome. Now we have, sorry.
We have those points here, and I think those are great, great focus points for us moving forward. So we will take a look at that, Angela, and it's a pleasure to be able to present to y'all. Any other questions? Oh, let's see.
We got Member Cha.
Member Shaw.
Thank you for presenting those. really, just a quick question. Do we have also data? I know that some of the mottos for the civilian oversight bodies comes from some of the cities in California. Do we have some data on which of our law enforcement agencies have citizens oversight committees, and if there's a particular motto that they're using? I see that places like SF has one in San Diego, but do you all have that data on hand to also provide us?
Yeah, so, I don't know why I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Is that me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, so we will be looking at the wave 1 and 2 law enforcement entities in California and looking at the type of civilian oversight entity that they have. So we can compare it against what the literature says about, the effectiveness of civilian oversight and the features that lend themselves, like to Angela's question, what were the causal factors that were reducing the decrease in racial disparities, particularly in the low discretionary scenarios? So that is going to be part of the report as well. Go ahead. I'm sorry, I
Sure,
can't see the names here. Yeah.
That's all right. Thank you. So first of all, thanks again. I also appreciate the presentation. I have a question slash suggestion, I guess. So I think it would be very helpful for the digestion of a report like this to put in very plain language what the actual powers of each quote unquote civilian oversight board is in each one of these places or models. In my experience studying these and being part of these off and on at city and county levels, they are largely advisory. In other words, they don't have any power. I mean, I'm just going to be very frank. They don't have any power in 9 out of 10 cases. And I think, one of the mistakes that's made is a whole lot of language and analysis and effort goes on around these things, and that almost kind of mystifies that central point that at the end of the day, this group of people don't really have any decision-making power for that law enforcement agency. And in fact, even our IPA's office only has very limited sort of input in law enforcement in San Jose, for example. And so one of my other questions was actually going to be whether or not there was any relationship between these civilian oversight boards and those IPO offices, as kind of like a side note, tangential question. But I think my main point is for these reports, I think a very plain language, even just like in a table, kind of display of like, here's what each one of these committees, commissions, boards actually has the power to do. What do they actually do as action items? What are their powers, and what are their relationships relative to the law enforcement agency?
Yeah, and I think that's something we can definitely include. We might have already kind of started that in our outline. That's so in addition to the powers and authorities, we do the strengths and the weaknesses as to each. And then the statistical impact that it has on the racial disparity.
Yeah, I definitely think that some of the pieces were there for sure. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And I was trying to condense down to 10 minutes, yeah. So yeah, you're right. I see that. Any other questions? Feel free to jump in. Yasmin, I don't know if you if there's anything further.
Not at this time, unless anyone else from the subcommittee has any questions or comments. There is another agenda item later on in today's meeting for more discussion of the board report. And I did want to flag for subcommittee members that we will still have Martha and Rebecca present if any questions do come up at that point. But if there's nothing else from the subcommittee members, I think we can move on to the next agenda item. And Board Member Hawkins, is showing that you're muted on my end.
Thank you, Department of Justice and subcommittee members. Next item on the agenda is regarding the 2025 recommendations and the items that we tabled. I believe we have members of POST with us today. If so, can those representatives introduce themselves?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chair Hawkins, for having us today. My name is Megan Polis. I am with POST, and I am the RIPA liaison between POST and the RIPA board. Some of you I've gotten the pleasure to work with already. So happy to be here again today and discuss these items for you. And with me is our Assistant Executive Director, Anne Marie Dalmanayo. She oversees the Peace Officers Standards and Accountability Division, or as we refer to as POSAD. So I think today we were given some items to talk about, but I think right now we're going to address the two items that were in the RIPA report, the 2025 RIPA report, that were direct recommendations to POST that we did respond to in our response report to that. There were two recommendations, I believe, made by this or in this section of accountability. And would it be helpful if I read those recommendations and then just kind of went over the response to that? Would that be helpful?
Sure, so we can bring everyone up to date what the recommendations were. I know they had something to do with youth policy and civilian complaints and a critical call for a broader accountability and law enforcement conduct, but let's get into the details.
Okay, so I know that those ones we did not address in our report response, and we can talk about those after the accountability piece. We can certainly address the civilian complaints part of that. But in our response to RIPA, the first recommendation that we addressed was to develop guidelines to assist law enforcement agencies in developing procedures to conduct adequate investigations into complaints alleging bias, and guidelines that assist law enforcement agencies with aligning their policies with Penal Code 13510.8. And the guidelines should also apprise law enforcement agencies how to educate the public ways in which a complaint could be filed, and in developing the guidelines for investigating complaints about demonstrating bias, POST could consult with the RIPA board. So POST did agree to partially support this recommendation, and that we've already basically begun work on this piece. POST was tasked with Assembly Bill 443 to create guidelines for conducting for the purpose of conducting internal investigations, a definition of bias. So we've already held those first workshops back in March, which I believe, well, I know that the RIPA board participated in that definition discussion. We will actually be presenting those definitions to the commission on June 4th next week. And our agenda is already published online with that item that includes those proposed definitions that we will be discussing at the commission meeting. And also, in addition to these guidelines, we are going to be adding this to some internal investigation guidelines that we are working on. This will be an appendix to that. So
well, also, just to touch on a couple of other areas that this touches is, it was one about officers who may have demonstrated bias throughout the course of their duties, and whether or not those investigations include elements of determination whether the decisions or actions by the officer stem from some sort of, conscious or unconscious bias, explicit or, otherwise, implicit bias. So that's one aspect, and there is definitions, and then there's some guidance that's going to be presented to the commission. The other aspect is looking at how we're conducting the backgrounds of peace officers in terms of looking at different social media checks, different avenues by which we're checking to see if there's any demonstration of bias in the peace officer's background. And so those elements will be added to our background manual. So it kind of touches, different aspects of post guidance that is currently exists, but we will be updating it based on the work we've done in the AB 443 workshop.
Okay.
Questions on that particular item before I move on to the next one? Okay, so the next one was to issue guidance apprising officers and law enforcement agencies about the anti-retaliation and workplace protections afforded to an officer who files a complaint against a fellow officer or their agency, or who cooperates with an investigation into an allegation of serious conduct. To provide protection for officers who report serious misconduct of fellow officers and to encourage a culture of accountability, the board recommends that the legislature amend Penal Code 13510.8 to include whistleblower protection for peace officers and other individuals within a law enforcement agency who report serious misconduct by fellow peace officers. So Post deemed this as that there was no action to be taken on this because the topic was covered sufficiently. This is something that's already a protection that's already provided in California Labor Code 1102.5. So we feel that that's sufficient in this case to protect those officers who might come out against another one.
So there's whistleblower protections in the labor code. There's also an avenue by which, under the serious misconduct abuse of power, that Post may be able to act in cases where an officer is being disciplined by the agency, or actions are taken against the officer for reporting something that happens within the agency, that the person in authority may in fact be charged with an abuse of power under the Post regulations and 13510.8 that already exists. So there is some protections under 13510.8 as it's currently written in terms of abuse of power. In addition to that, as Megan mentioned, there's a couple of other accountability recommendations that were sent over today. And I think these are, I'm not sure, maybe I should ask this question. Would you like us to address these additional topics that were sent over in the attachment today? One of them has to do with adding additional categories of serious misconduct that are harmful to the public, but may not be included currently in 13510.8.
Yes.
Okay, so as that is an avenue by which anyone, of course, can approach the legislature to add additional categories of serious misconduct or expand the definition that currently exists in 13510.8, and something that Post can discuss with the commission in terms of, are there other categories that perhaps pose a significant risk to the public that are not inclusive in the 9 definitions? So clearly that's something that, there may be some interest in approaching the legislature to expand those definitions. Any questions on that one, or is there a topic specific that you wanted me to address in terms of what we're seeing in the reports that are submitted to Post? Board Member Sierra.
Yes, I would just be curious. Like thus far, has there been a category that hasn't been covered that Post is seeing that maybe has been thinking about that should be added, or is there any insight you may have on that?
Sure. So what we see often in terms of an area that perhaps does not fall within one of the 9 definitions, but is a factor in cases that we see that may result in some wrongdoing, is neglect of duty. So it's a pretty broad category, but it's where a peace officer may not have exercised their law enforcement responsibilities at all. And that in and of itself can place the public at risk. So I would say that's probably one of the broader categories that's currently not covered. Obviously, as you know, the definition of dishonesty is very narrow in the 9 acts. It has to do with that related to reporting of a criminal act or a crime in progress, investigation of a criminal act, or if someone is under investigation for serious misconduct and is dishonest during the course of that investigation. So it's limited to those timeframes and those specific areas of dishonesty. So that would be my comment regarding kind of a broader category that's not currently covered.
Thank you.
You're welcome. The second element was about the immediate temporary suspension of an officer, where the executive director currently has the authority to issue an immediate temporary suspension under very limited circumstances if the individual was terminated for serious misconduct or resigned during the course of a pending investigation for serious misconduct and or has been arrested or charged with a felony or a qualifying misdemeanor. And there's a recommendation here that, should that immediate temporary suspension continue, even if post loses jurisdiction, let's say on someone who may be arrested for a felony. And ultimately, let's say the DA does not file charges, post may lose jurisdiction of that ITS, and therefore, there's not that temporary hold. And at this point, we haven't seen that as a real issue. Most of the time, we're able to retain jurisdiction of the immediate temporary suspension. We will, if we do lose jurisdiction, we don't lose jurisdiction over the case. And oftentimes the officers at the time there's been an ITS issued are no longer employed by the agency. They've separated either by termination or they've resigned during the course of the pending investigation, so they're not currently employed. There's always a risk, right, of the officer regaining employment at another agency, if not under an ITS. Most often, I can tell you that when we're conducting an investigation into serious misconduct, that agency that may potentially hire that peace officer is required to check with Post to determine whether there's any pending serious misconduct investigation. It would be very unusual for an agency to pick up an officer that's under a serious misconduct investigation with Post, regardless of the ITS. So I'm not sure that this poses as much of a risk at this point, but I just wanted to be able to touch on it with the subcommittee. The only caveat here would be, there could be a change that says the ITS remains in effect until Post completes its investigation into serious misconduct, regardless of whether we lose jurisdiction because of an initial arrest. That's something the subcommittee may consider. However, at this point, we don't see this one as the more concerning loophole in the law. The other areas, and you can let me know if you want us to address this or if this is just something that you're considering for your future 2026 report, has to deal with civilian complaints and the youth policy recommendation. These are not recommendations that have been responded to by the commission. They weren't part of our report. But if there's anything about those recommendations you'd like us to, provide you our input on, or at least get some clarification on, I'm happy to do so. I'm not sure if this is the time to do that.
Can we address those when we get to that part of the agenda?
Yeah, I didn't know if we were part of that agenda or if that's something that you guys do on your own without Post in the room. So that's up to you if you want us to participate during that part of the agenda, or if you would like for us to kind of discuss the 3 recommendations that came to us as the civilian complaints that may have a Post element. I'm happy to touch on them, and maybe that will help further the discussion about your 2026 report, if that is permissible.
DOJ?
I'm seeing some nods from some of the subcommittee members, so I think that would be great.
Okay. So one of them is that Post modify its existing complaint form, where there's basically civilian complaints can be filed directly with Post regarding any of the serious misconduct categories under Senate Bill 2, and that we have an age indicator that there is some way to distinguish between those that are 17 years and younger and those between the ages of 18 and 24 as part of a data point, and that we would modify our complaint form. I think I'd have a question about that in terms of, are we looking at just capturing the data, or are we looking at this from a prioritization perspective where we are trying to determine a vulnerable population that would escalate the prioritization of the complaint handling? Because those are two different things. If it's a data point, that's one thing that we collect the data and we can check to see if we can modify our current case management system to accept that data and to report on that data, because it would be a modification to the case management system. Or is it a means by which posts would be looking at vulnerable populations to perhaps prioritize complaints that are coming to post? So I'd like some clarification on that. Board Member Hawkins?
Hi, data is essential to understanding how law enforcement actions are impacting our young people.
Okay, so it's data at this point.
It's data.
Okay.
Ask other board members because they may have a different opinion.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else want to ring in on that?
This is Angela. Yeah, yes, I think there were kind of twofold, as I recall, because I think we have another recommendation that we had not, though, we did not move forward for last year's report about having that data point and that information be a consideration as post, or the decision maker is reviewing whether serious misconduct has occurred, that would be one factor among others, but an explicit factor to consider if it involves a youth. I don't believe we had thought as a board or talked about whether or not it could also be used to prioritize, the speed of the investigation. I don't think that had come up, but it was, as I recall, kind of for two potential purposes: collecting the data so that we could be analyzing that, as well as what significance it may have at the decision-making point. And one other area that, when we had discussed this as a full board, is, are there, to the extent there are upsides, are there any downsides that can be identified in kind of pursuing this path?
What I would say to that is, I think we look at vulnerable populations now. So not just youth, but we look at elderly, we look at those with mental disabilities in terms of how we determine the egregiousness of the act or action or inaction by the peace officer. So under our California Code of Regulations 1213, we take into consideration the egregious nature of the act and the risk to the public. And in doing so, we're always looking at vulnerable populations. So we would consider vulnerable populations to expand beyond the youth. So that's why I was concerned about, if we just say, hey, it's only youth that we look at in terms of prioritization, we'd be leaving out other vulnerable populations. And I think that needs to be a consideration and prioritization of the complaints and the public's welfare, correct? From the data point perspective, I totally recognize it's great data to just identify how many interactions are we having with those under the age of 17, how many interactions, occur between that age of 18 and 24. And I read the report, and you talked a lot about the root cause analysis of, how some of these things become systemic, right? If they have a negative impact with law enforcement at a very young age, then that can obviously have a multiplying effect later in life, in terms of how they view law enforcement, how law enforcement interacts with certain communities and certain populations. And so from that standpoint, I think the data might be helpful in looking at trying to prevent the furtherance of that perhaps negative interaction with the community if we can intersect that early, right? When they're having a negative interaction at a very young age, how do we intersect that and try to change that on both sides so that that doesn't perpetuate itself into later years within a certain community. That's from a data perspective, and then looking at root cause analysis. Looking at vulnerable populations, I think we need to expand beyond just the youth being the vulnerable population in terms of prioritization.
Great, thank you. I just have a follow-up question. If for post to have the authority to amend the complaint, let's say would be the recommendation or wants to amend the complaint to include age. Is that something that would have to flow from legislation? Or just
To
would
amend,
Post be able to do that? To amend the Post's complaint form?
no, it does not have to go through legislation to amend that. We could just decide that, you know, as a commission, it would have to go before the commission. And because the complaint form is captured in regulation, it would take regulation changes to amend any of our forms that are codified in
Okay.
regulation. But that's not a legislative change, no.
Great, thank you.
Welcome. Ms. Hawkins, did you have another question?
I'm having a problem getting my hand down. I don't know how to look. Sorry. And
That's
no-
okay. I would be the same way, so.
Sorry. Continue.
Okay, that's kind of all I had. The three civilian complaint youth policy recommendations are really all encompassing the same thing, right? It's looking at whether or not we identify age as a factor for consideration. And so I think we kind of covered that globally. The 1205 changes wouldn't be necessary. It'd be in another regulation that our complaint form is included in. If we were to amend our complaint form, and we can get you that regulation, I can't think of it off the top of my head, but it's in one of the regulations that we have the civilian complaint provisions.
Okay.
Are there any other updates you would like from Post at this time? Programmatic updates?
Oh, one more thing, and I don't know how to put this. It's like engaging community groups to identify additional harmful conduct that may not be codified, but still violates the core responsibility of peace officers.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the one that we were talking about is should we expand those definitions, right? Are there things that are not currently codified in legislation that perhaps we believe are a tremendous public risk? Or, you know, are kind of one of those more frequent things we see that we don't have the ability to perhaps act upon at this point in time. I think it goes back to that. The one we see most often is neglect of duty and perhaps an expansion of dishonesty. Those would be the two I would say would be more prevalent in our experience in looking at those definitions.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any questions, subcommittee? Any discussion, comments? Well, I just want to say thank you to Post for coming down and having this discussion with us. These recommendations were grounded in real concerns from our community, particularly youth, and reflects our commitment to building a law enforcement accountability system that is just, responsive, and reflective of the people it serves. And we say thank you.
Thank you for your time this afternoon.
Thank you.
Really quickly before we let our Post representatives go, I just wanted to flag, there was a question in the chat asking for the meeting link for the June 4th Post Commission. Is that something that you're able to provide for us or let us know where members of the public can watch that commission meeting?
Yeah, they can actually watch it on the Post website. We also have a YouTube channel, but I'm happy to put the link to that in the chat here before we leave.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
If no further discussions, again, I'd like to thank Post for attending today's meeting, and let's move on to the next agenda item. That's the board discussion of the 2026 RIPA report draft. Let's get right into that. The first part of it is the accountability outline. Do any board members have comments or questions regarding the draft provided by the Department of Justice? Any questions? Okay, let's.
Dr. Hawkins, if you don't mind, I just wanted to flag for the subcommittee members. This is basically the primary opportunity for any substantive input that you have on this year's accountability and complaints sections of the report. Since we only have one more subcommittee meeting for this year, the next draft that you see will be hopefully close to final. So we would love to hear your thoughts on what is included so far on the presentation that you heard earlier from Martha and Rebecca, whether there's anything else you would like to see included, whether you have any questions, or any suggested edits as well.
I'll jump in. I just here, I just wanted to just reiterate the comments I made earlier during the presentation. I think from each of the board members as well, for I think those to be woven in and built out would be really great. But I think this is really going in a great direction, and I think it's going to have some really helpful information for the board as well as the public and policymakers. So I very much support, the direction this is going. I don't think I have any other comments other than the ones that I indicated earlier. And I guess the final thing or additional thing I'd point out is to the extent that we're looking at our past recommendations about, for example, age, we may have to consider, I'd like us to think about a little more, and maybe it can be built out for our next subcommittee meeting. This issue about, the regulation, and I think it was 1213, that was referenced by Post, that, looking at all kinds of vulnerable populations and not wanting or, suggesting that we don't want to just only look at age, kind of how maybe just a little bit of deeper dive into that for us to consider to the extent that we may want to think about that recommendation again. But it sounds like there's a little more work we have to do there on that issue. If we were to make, a recommendation along those lines, we have to be, I think, worried about unintended consequences and how best to approach that if that's something that we're still interested in. Thank you.
And I have a question. I don't know if Post answered this, if we discussed it, but I just wanted to know what support is Post providing to Wave 2 agencies newly formed after SB2 to ensure that they have the tools, funding, and independence needed to be effective. Are you familiar with Wave 2? Because we see all agencies now. Hello?
Could you repeat that question, Lawanda?
Okay. Oh, the question was, what support is Post providing to, I say Wave 2, agencies newly formed after SB2 to ensure they have the tools, funding, and the independent needs to be effective? Because remember, we were only looking at Wave 1 at one time of law enforcement. Now we have Wave 1 and Wave 2. That's the whole entire state. Only one part. How did they? Yeah. So we're trying to make sure that these small agencies have the tools and fundings too, because we have small agencies that sometimes don't have the funding or tools to, how do you say? The laws may be in place, but they're not able to implement them because they don't have the funding to do it.
I'm not sure. I don't have any thoughts on that. Yeah, Yasmin or Bill.
Sure. Thank you, Member Smith. Just to clarify, if this is a question for Post specifically, I don't believe we have our representatives from Post on the line anymore. But this is something that we can forward to them for further information.
Okay. Yeah, it was addressed to Post.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I'm just trying to get a read on, and thanks for jumping in, Chauncey. I'm trying to get a read on what we're doing right now. Are we trying to discuss our suggestions for the 2026 report?
Yes.
And if so, do we need to make a motion for anything that we want to do here, or is someone just taking notes on our thoughts with DOJ? I just want to make sure we know what we're doing here.
No need for a motion, but we are taking notes, and then there will also be the meeting recording and minutes that we can consult to further develop the report. So this is the opportunity for you all to just kind of brainstorm through anything else that you would like to see in the report or what you think of the direction so far.
But okay, so then I want to jump in and sort of second Member Hawkins' suggestion. So the reason I'm going to say that is because this gets into a longer conversation I was having with DOJ and some of the researchers of the original SB2 data, and this was some time ago, many months ago now. And in those conversations, one of the things we discussed were some of the things we wanted to maybe go deeper with and follow-ups in the next annual reports on SB2 stuff. And so I think and please excuse me, Lawanda, if I'm speaking out of turn here, correct me if I say anything incorrectly. Well, I think part of what Lawanda is trying to say is that one of the issues that we wanted to look deeper into qualitatively was whether or not we were seeing these discrepancies geographically, in part because of discrepancies of funding, because those agencies in those areas don't have the resources to pursue SB2 cases. That's the simplest way I have to say that. Is that correct, Lawanda?
You hit it right on the head.
Cool. So I think I just would like to add a little bit to that, right? So I think what we want is again more of a qualitative dive into some of this data, following up on it as well, right? Let's see if we have the same geographical discrepancies. Let's see if it's still LA pretty much with a ton of these SB2 cases, but very few from the Bay, like this kind of stuff. But I'm hoping that we could get into some follow-up questions, again, qualitative data into why we're seeing those discrepancies. And again, I think one of the lines of questioning was what Lawanda's pointing to, which is resource. But I think there are several others, right? There are several other potential reasons why we would see some of those discrepancies. But I think some of the things that we discussed in DOJ, anyone can correct me if I'm wrong, my recollection of our prior conversations was trying to look into who's filing all these cases in LA and talking to them, seeing kind of what's going on, talking to some folks in the Bay and other major metros to see why is this not moving forward in the same way? Are you running into issues? Is something or someone standing in the way of these filings? Whatever it happens to be. I think that was something that we had discussed as a possibility for the follow-up years.
Bill, you hit it on the head. Anyone else?
Hey, I got to try sometimes to do something right. You know what I mean?
Thank you. Anyone else? We spoke a lot before about the youth, and we wanted to make sure that we were getting the data on the youth, because we were concerned that the tracking of the system for the youth individuals under the age of 25, the data may not have all been there, that may not have all been as clear. And so we were recommendation is to still look at the youth, the complaint, handling the framework of the youth. We need to really we need to watch it. And we need to have a statewide oversight effectiveness dashboard tracking the performance and outcome of the civilian oversight agencies. We need to see the number of complaints received and how are they resolved. Racial breakdowns of these complaints, the outcome, and the transparency. What's actually really going on. We talk about it, but we're not getting, So we need a little bit more information when it comes to this for 2026, if they don't mind. And I think we need to expand the definition of serious misconduct, because that can be, how do you say it? The definition is too broad. So I think it needs to be a little bit narrow, what we consider serious misconduct. We need to look at that because, I don't know. Some things we might consider serious misconduct and it may not be taken as serious misconduct. And so I think we need to look at that. I think it needs to be more community participation in SB2, decertification review. I think it needs to be, especially when you have all these different communities up and down the state of California. So it needs to be more community participation to make sure that everyone's voice, they feel as though their voice is being heard. So I think we need to have a little bit more community participation when it comes to things like that. Jump in, please. I'm just giving out recommendations. Let me know how you feel about some of these. What about the survivors and family support and complaint process? Any feedback? Okay. Should we move to the next item on the agenda? Okay. And I think that is public comments. Am I right, Department of Justice?
That's correct. That is the next item on the agenda. We do have a good amount of time left at this point. So we have a little over an hour left. I just want to make sure that we have covered everything that the subcommittee members would like to cover in terms of both the accountability section and the complaint section of the report. So just prompting again, I know Co-Chair Hawkins has already done this, but just in case, if any of the subcommittee members have any further thoughts on accountability and complaints, this is the time to do that. Otherwise, the next item on the agenda is public comment. Hearing nothing, Co-Chair Hawkins, it looks like it is time to move on to public comment.
Okay. Well, we're at the portion of the agenda where we hear from the community, and this is the best part. Okay. Can we hear anyone from Southern California would like to give us a comment or suggestion or a recommendation?
Yes.
Okay.
So, I
Want to
listened
identify yourself first?
I'm the Jamaican.
Okay. Good afternoon.
Thank you. Good afternoon to you and to everyone. I listened to the last group of comments and I was a little bit unclear as to who is being addressed as the youth and the interactions with youth. And the question was whether or not interactions with youth was being properly captured. It's not clear because in the context of post complaints, I don't know the answer. But in the context of interactions with the police, I do know the answer. And the answer is the great majority of those interactions are not captured in the data that we see. And that is because the REPA board, in all its wisdom, decided against making field interviews mandatory reportable items. They're only reported if certain things happen. It is also very well known that the majority of interactions with youth are resolved by field interviews. So let us leave that for where it is. I have two other things. In last week's comments by people from Post, a pair of comments were made by one of Post's representatives, and this is what I took it to mean. When asked about discussions on racial profiling that took place within the confines of Post Academy, it was said that the matter of racial profiling, indeed, the matter of race, was never mentioned. It is clear to me, and it should be clear to you, that if Post believes what I say Post believes and preaches, that racial profiling is a non-existent thing, it exists in the minds of people like me and you, there is no reason for them to discuss race or racial profiling. And I think what I heard was correct. So when we entertain Post and we give them this forum to pretend to care, we are wasting our time and the public's time. I would have them be defunded. Now, let us end. I will end with reports that have been made on accountability and how this board and the California Department of Justice treats them. If in 1 year, there are a large number of complaints that are filed, but in the succeeding year, this board and the DOJ receives an indication that there are no complaints, it behooves the board and every one of us to question that which is reported in that succeeding year. We must not indulge in happy talk, which is what we have done. San Francisco, San Diego are prime examples. They had the highest numbers followed by 0 complaints. We cannot report the zeros. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. Are there any comments from Northern California?
I'm here in Southern California.
Okay, hi, good afternoon.
Hello, my name is Michelle Wittig. Can you hear? I guess you can. I have a couple of suggestions. I think it would be very helpful if the board would include a section in the 2026 report that provides guidelines or best practices for local civilian oversight bodies. For example, encouraging recording and posting of the audios or videos of those meetings on the local government website. Posting of the minutes of those meetings on the local government website. Posting the text and the PowerPoint slides of all presentations to the body. Encouraging the conduct of meetings in a manner that proactively seeks community engagement. Not to interpret presentations by the local police department to the politically appointed members of the board as sufficient for meeting the community engagement criterion. Meet in the community, not someplace at City Hall that might not be as accessible. And try as much as possible to employ a format that encourages interactive discussion. Thanks.
Thanks for sharing. Are there any more comments from Southern California? If not, we'll go to Northern California. Are there any comments from Northern California? Are there any comments from Central California? Are there any other public comments? Jump in if you're using this, your cell phone, you can just jump in and make a comment. Hearing none, I'd like to thank members of the public for your comments. Moving on, discussion of next steps. Before we conclude today's meeting, I'd like to ask Department of Justice if there are any questions regarding next steps.
Thank you so much, Co-Chair Hawkins, and thank you to the subcommittee members for today's discussion. Before we wrap up, I just want to make sure that we have clear directions from you all in developing this year's report. So what we've heard so far are essentially, I think, 3 primary tasks. And please let me know if there's anything to add to this or if anything is incorrect. So what I have on the list so far is to continue developing the civilian oversight section, which includes adding a chart or a display to clearly demonstrate in plain language the power that each civilian oversight body has or what actions they're able to take. Also, any analysis or data discussing the causal link between the presence of civilian oversight and reduction of racial disparities. And then also looking into whether civilian oversight can be applied to stop data to address racial disparities. Before moving on to the other topics, is there anything to add for civilian oversight?
Anything about the youth?
Sure. So with I had for youth, I had that as a slightly different topic, not as civilian oversight. Is that the subcommittee's understanding as well? Okay, so let's come back to youth. Is there anything for civilian oversight? I see Angela.
Yeah, the one thing, and I think it's already somewhat woven in there, but you know, to LaWanda's comments about, you know, ensuring that the community is involved in involvement, and I think that is somewhat already woven in, you know, and to the last comment about some concrete ways that oversight committees can involve, you know, the community by being more transparent to the extent that these are not like a closed door meetings, to the extent that they are open meetings. You know, I thought, you know, having those very concrete ideas and woven in could be helpful, kind of addressing what LaWanda had brought up.
Wonderful. Thank you, Member Sierra. I've got that written down here as well. Is there anything else that the subcommittee would like to see in the civilian oversight section of the accountability draft for the next meeting? Okay. The other items that we have on the list are to develop additional analysis of the SB2 decertification actions for this year. And that would include also a qualitative data analysis to the extent we can do that this year, looking both at the geographic disparities of SB2 decertification actions, and then to the extent we can try and identify any systemic causes. So as Member Armelin was mentioning, and as Member Hawkins had mentioned as well, lack of funding or any other contributing factors that may result in these disparities. Is that correct? And is there anything else to add for the SB2 section of this year's report? Member Sierra?
Okay. So just on that last point, if we are unable at this stage to identify systemic causes, what we could at least do at a minimum, I think, is explain or try to figure out the funding stream out of SB2, you know, to the extent that is it a funded mandate? Do departments get additional monies to do this or not? You know, that might be helpful just to give a framework at a minimum of the costs to law enforcement agencies and how that is being addressed. And if we can identify systemic causes, that would be great. But to the extent we don't yet have the data or the time, yeah, I think it would be helpful just to kind of understanding of the funding, whether I'm not sure to the extent that post would have anything to do with that, but it may be more of a legislative matter.
We can certainly look into that for the next meeting. We appreciate it, Member Sierra.
Thank you.
Is there anything else that the subcommittee would like to see with respect to SB2 for the next draft of the report?
Okay, one additional thing. To the extent if we are going to reconsider former recommendations that we had tabled, you know, we had one table recommendation about adding age as a data point, which we discussed with Post. But we had the separate recommendation is how that data point might be relevant in an adjudication. And so I think the additional item would be kind of looking into how, if we wanted to address that, you know, how that impacts the regulation that I believe it was 1213, so as to not kind of undermine or make it so narrow that it doesn't affect other vulnerable populations. So that would be something for our next meeting.
Wonderful, we can look into that. And then the last item that we have on the list is to look into, and I think this is similar, so talking about tabled recommendations. I believe we have an item to look at, I apologize, many notes here. I think this is actually similar to what Member Sierra was saying. So I think this is, that was what I had as the third item on our list for DOJ. Is there anything else? So we have the development of civilian oversight, development of SB2, and then taking a look at these past recommendations given the new information from Post today to see if there's anything that the subcommittee would like to move forward with. Is there anything else that the subcommittee would like to see for the next draft of the accountability section or of the complaints section? Okay, and I do want to give Martha and Rebecca an opportunity if they have any questions for you all. Martha and Rebecca, please feel free to jump in.
I don't have any further questions.
Yeah, no questions from me either. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you both. So I think we have our marching orders. I can turn it back over to you, Co-Chair Hawkins, if you have any other topics or questions you'd like to discuss with the subcommittee before we wrap up.
Thank you, Yasmin. Subcommittee, any questions or comments or concerns? Okay, now we've concluded our discussion. Is there a motion to adjourn today's meeting?
I also move.
Second.
Thank you. Please conclude the meeting. That's it. Bye-bye, everyone.
Okay.
Good afternoon. Bye-bye. DOJ, is that it?
That's it. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for attending and for today's productive discussion. We look forward to seeing you at the next meeting.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.